Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. For the last probably about 5 years, Tamron has pretty much been able to dominate the travel zoom space all-in-one for full frame with their 28 to 200 millimeter RXD lens. Now there is a Sony branded lens, but that lens is considerably older and not nearly as optically competent as this, so this has been the lens I've been recommending for years. Over the last couple of months, however, we've seen first Sigma with their 20 to 200 millimeter and then Tamron with their updated 25 to 200 millimeter enter into the space and now give us more options. Now, unfortunately, I did not manage to have the Sigma and the new Tamron together at the same time, and so that I could do one of my true head-to-head videos where I can shoot them in identical situations. And so for those of you that are looking for a video like that, I want you to know up front, I'm not able to do that here. But I thought you would probably still like, many of you, to hear at least a quick video of my observations, having now used all of these three lenses extensively and reviewing them, knowing that I'd want to draw some comparisons as to what I feel are the relative strengths and weaknesses for each one. And so if that is interesting to you, stay tuned and we're going to jump in together why you should choose each one of these three lenses. So let's start by taking a look at the price of all three of these lenses. The least expensive is the 28 to 200 from Tamron at $800 MSRP. The 25 to 200 is $899 or $900 MSRP. And then the Sigma is the most expensive at $1,999. Now, at the moment, all three of them are available. This lens will probably not be on the market for too much longer, basically probably when they sell out the original stock. With all the other G1 lenses, they have been phased out once the G2 lenses are readily available. Just bear that in mind moving ahead. So let's start by talking about the Sigma and reasons to choose it. And so I'm going to give you a short list of positives and then a couple of primary negatives for each one of these lenses. So as far as the positives, obviously the Sigma's big appeal is that it has the ability to go all the way to 20 millimeters. And you can see relative to the 28 to 200 that is a radical difference. And so if I then show you the difference between the 25 to 200 and the 28 to 200, you can see that it is a difference. And so obviously it's not going to be as significant between the 20 millimeter on the wide end and the 25 millimeter on the newer Tamron. However, that is a significant difference. There's no question you're going to be able to get certain scenes in frame on the Sigma that you just can't on either one of the Tamrons. Because it goes wider, it also means that it has the biggest zoom ratio. It has a 10 times zoom ratio and thus the most focus possibilities in terms of the framing there along the way. It also has the most useful maximum magnification. On paper, both the Tamron and the Sigma, the newer Tamron and the Sigma, can achieve a 0.50 times magnification or a 1:2 magnification ratio. However, the Sigma, you can manage to hit that mark anywhere between 28 and about 85 millimeters. So it gives you a lot of different useful framing opportunities, including with a longer focal length where you can be a little bit further away and have a little bit better working distance. Technically, the Tamron can achieve that same as well, but it does so in a way that is almost unusable in my opinion. You have to be only 2 centimeters away from your subject, which means it would be well within the actual lens hood range, as you can see from this, and it's almost impossible to not fully shade your subject when you're that close to it. So to me, not nearly as useful, so I like the Sigma's magnification the best. The Sigma is the only one of the three to have a dedicated AF/MF switch, and if that's a big deal to you, then certainly something to consider. The autofocus from the HLA, high-speed linear actuator focus motor, is excellent on the Sigma, and so it has nice, snappy autofocus, really great on that front. The main downsides to the Sigma relative to the others is that it has by far the least light gathering potential. It starts slower, it ends slower, and more importantly, it very quickly arrives at very small maximum apertures. The most significant difference is that it hits f5.6 by just 51 millimeters, whereas the 28 to 200, which is the best of the bunch in that regard, it doesn't hit f5.6 until 147 millimeters. And so if you are to go through and you calculate the brightness averages here, it averages out to being an f4 lens, whereas the Sigma averages out to being an f5.6 lens. That's a full stop difference, almost a different class of lens. The 25-200, as you can see from this chart, it falls somewhere in between, but it is closer to the 28-200 than it is to the 20-200 from Sigma. So that is a big issue. Also, the Sigma is really compromised by going so wide. On the wide end, it has absolutely terrible barrel distortion. It's by far the most amount of distortion and by far the most complex distortion. It has the most vignette, so much so that if I'm trying to manually correct, I have to crank the slider all the way, and there's still more vignette to be corrected after that. And so it is really optically compromised to get to that 20mm mark in a way that neither of the other two lenses are. And so some really great strengths, but also probably the most profound weaknesses come on the Sigma lens. How about reasons to choose the new Tamron 25-200? Well, obviously, it has far less distortion, though it goes wider than what the 28. And the 28 is really good on the distortion front, but it's not nearly as wide. Even at 25mm, the distortion pattern, there's definitely barrel distortion there, but it's very linear. It's less than half the distortion that you're going to see on the Sigma. It's very easy to correct. It's not going to be a real-world issue, whereas the Sigma's is so profound that even with electronic corrections, it still leaves some damage in its wake. And so I think that Tamron did a much better job of finding the balance between going wider but not completely optically destroying their lens design. It's $100 cheaper than the Sigma, and that could be a significant factor for some people. The Tamron has the most robust weather sealing. It has around 11 seal points, whereas the Sigma has around 7 seal points. So the Tamron is just the more robust in terms of the build quality and just the overall professional grade of weather sealing inside. It is brighter throughout the zoom range relative to the Sigma, though it is dimmer relative to the older 28-200. I knew that there was going to be some compromise involved unless they actually grew the size of the lens significantly, which they didn't do, which means that it doesn't have as much light gathering potential, but it's still very good for a lens in this class. And so I will give it some regard for that. This is the only one lens of the three that actually gives you some customization options. And so what that means is that through the USB-C port and then the button and the rings, you have some options. You can utilize this to customize the function of the custom button there, but also you can customize the way that the focus ring works, whether it's linear, non-linear, how far the throw is, whether you would like to switch it between being a focus and an aperture ring. You have the option to do that as well. And so you have some ability to tweak the controls to your preference in a way that you don't with the other lenses. While I've already complained about the way that it gets to that maximum stated magnification, which I think is unusable, I did find that I could shoot at around 47mm and 47 to 50mm in that range. And I could actually get a very high level of magnification, not as good as the Sigma and not as good as its maximum potential, but a very usable and very high level that has a nice flat plane of focus, good sharpness and contrast. And so it still is a very usable metric. You just have to figure out the best way to get the best performance out of it. It also has the best autofocus. It has a VXD focus motor, which is a voice coil, extreme torque, linear drive, kind of a wordy way of saying a good quality voice coil motor. But what's more, Tamron has a little bit of an advantage that Sigma doesn't, in that Sony, at least on E-mount, because Sony has a little over 15% stake in Tamron, and it feels like Tamron lenses maybe get a little bit of that inside connection. And thus, I found that it was the best for tracking action. I could shoot birds in flight, no problem with it, and get really consistent results out of that. So, that's nice. I also feel like it has the nicest bokeh of the three. While the 28-200 is good as well, there is a little bit extra that goes into the newer 25-200, and so I think it does really well there. It also is really strong when it comes to flare resistance, and it is the sharpest lens by at least a margin, depending on where you're at. It's a small or a little bit bigger margin, but it is the sharpest of the three lenses. And so I feel like they've done a great job of making less optical compromises, even though they stretch that zoom range a little bit. So as far as the negatives go, the biggest negative is that I feel like the 1 to 2 times magnification or 0.50 times is basically just marketing. It's almost impossible to get that in any kind of usable way. So I would forget that. That's just them, trying to put out something that's competitive in terms of their marketing, but not really realistic. And of course, as a secondary negative, it loses some brightness relative to the lens that it replaces. It's not as bright as the 28-200. So that leads us finally to reasons to choose the 28-200. Well, it is the cheapest. Now, as I mentioned, it's probably going to get phased out of the new market, but there are probably going to be a lot of them on the used market with some newer options available. It's still a really solid lens. It's not as sexy as the other two. It's older. It's a little bit more boring in terms of its design. It doesn't have as many features. However, it's still optically really, really solid. And while the autofocus isn't as good as the other two lenses, it's got a stepping type motor rather than a linear or voice coil type motor. However, I have been using this lens for 5 years at this point, and I've never had any issues with the autofocus. It's still a very good lens for that. And so I feel like it's still a viable option. It is the brightest of the three, and in some cases by a pretty good margin. And so if your priority is getting good light gathering, this is the best of the bunch. The negatives, obviously, while autofocus, as I've said, is good, it's not as good as either the other two that have newer, more sophisticated autofocus motors. It obviously also has the narrowest angle of view on the wide end. 28 millimeters is significantly less wide than either 25 or even more so 20 millimeters. And so it just means that there's going to be situations where you're in interior spaces, for example, where you just can't get as much as what you would like in the frame, whereas one of the other two, would do a better job there. It also obviously has the smallest zoom range, and of course, it's probably soon to be discontinued. So you wonder if it's going to achieve kind of the same level of support as the current lenses on the market. This is my conclusion after I've used all three lenses, one extensively, the other two for my dedicated review processes, thinking about how that they compare relative to other lenses in the class. To me, the new Sigma is too optically compromised in its quest to get the biggest width. It is the most attractive lens on paper, but in practice, it isn't. I find that there are just too many places where it is compromised relative to the other lenses, and I just feel like while you don't get as much width with the others, you get a better lens as a byproduct. The 25-200 millimeter isn't as wide, but it has much less compromises involved, and I feel like it represents the overall best package that's currently available. If I were buying one of these three lenses at this moment, I would buy the new 25-200 millimeter from Tamron. Now, I do think, as I mentioned, that the 28-200 is still a very viable option, and particularly if you're looking to make the smallest investment and you're not looking for a lens that has necessarily all the newest and the best, but just is just a really, really solid lens. This is a great option, particularly if you can get one maybe with sale prices upcoming as we get towards the holiday season, or if you get one off of a used market. It still might give you the best bang for the buck at the end of the day, even if it isn't quite as attractive in some ways as the new G2 lens that replaces it. So while this isn't as in-depth as some of these comparisons, I hope that this has given you what are my real-world observations as someone who's familiar with this class of lens. And having used all three of them, this is my takeaway, and hopefully that helps you in making your own buying decision. If you want my deeper thoughts on any of these three lenses, look in the description down below, and I do have links to both video and text reviews for all three. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.